Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Housing Summit 2.0 Progress Report. I'll just repeat that this event is presented by RESCON and sponsored by the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board and the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario. My name is Michael Giles. I am the Director of Municipal Affairs at RESCON, and I will be your moderator for this panel. I would like to remind everyone to leave your thoughts on the community board, see who else is attending in the attendees section, check out the documents shared in the resources tab, and visit our sponsor pages. If you have any technical issues during the event, please email our event manager, Sarah at actualmedia.ca. During the session, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat for review by our speakers, who will try, time permitting, to answer them. Now, I would like to introduce our panel for this discussion on how to achieve widespread choice in housing. In Underwood, David Amborski and Benjamin Dachis. Ian Underwood is the CEO of Habitat for Humanity, Greater Toronto Area, where she leads a team that assists working lower-income families build strength, stability, and self-reliance through affordable home ownership. Professor David Amborski is a professional urban planner and a professor at the Toronto Metropolitan University School of Urban and Regional Planning. He is also a founding director of the Center for Urban Research and Land Development. And Benjamin Dachis is the director of public affairs for the C.D. Howe Institute. He furthers the Institute's mission to improve Canada's economic performance by enhancing the visibility, reputation, and impact of its research and activity. And I can assure you their CVs are much longer than that. We're very fortunate to have them here today. But in the interest of time, we'll keep it to that. I am going to keep track of time. I have 3 timepieces in front of me. All 3 of them say something different, so I think I'll go with the middle one. Not vastly different, but enough that will keep us on track. So let's get right to it. What I'm going to do is, our format today is we're going to ask a couple of questions, 4 we have if time permits. I'll pose the question, and then we'll have each panelist, give their comments on it, and if they wish, they can sort of interchange with each other if that's what they wish to do. So let me begin with the first question, which reads: within the context of striving to achieve most expansive range of housing choice, and by extension of this, increased housing supply and substantially improved housing affordability, how do you see the calculus between ownership and rental options as potentially moving towards a goal of a wider range of housing options? And could you comment on the choices regarding single detached homes versus condo in the context of the market responding to actual demand? What we'll do is, if we can, we'll start with Ian and then move to David and Ben. So Ian, if you could start us off on that.
Well, thanks, Michael. And I know for everyone listening, we've heard a lot of stuff over the last 3 hours. And one of those things we have already heard a lot of people talk about on the supply side. It's the diversity of supply, in addition to how much that we're really suffering from. And I was really taken by the graph that Ted from CMHC put up. I don't know if people remember it, but he had one with bar charts showing in red housing unaffordability. So core housing need based on unaffordability, core housing need based on unsuitability. And if you picked up on it, it said in the city of Toronto, I'm going to flip back to it, but over 50% of households, according to this, close to 60 are unaffordable, and close to 40 are below suitability. And in Scarborough, the unaffordable is approaching 70, and the unsuitable is well over 50. So back to housing supply, that's telling us, okay, well, we definitely don't have diversity of housing supply here, right? When we have the majority of households in our cities living in housing that doesn't work for them. So, and I'll just pick up on Scarborough, and then I can come back to ownership. The fact that in Scarborough, if you want to build a 3-bedroom unit in Scarborough, you're going to pay exactly the same fees as if you're putting a 3-bedroom unit in a penthouse for a downsizing kind of 60-something couple to buy, is a disincentive for us to build the right kind of affordable mix of housing throughout our communities. Specific to ownership, Some people may have recall the Ipsos survey last spring, but the Global did an Ipsos poll. It showed that 72% of Ontarians have given, under the age of 55, have given up hope on ever owning a home. And of that group of non-homeowners, they have also said they agree that because they have no hope in ever owning a home, they're now focusing less on money and more on enjoying their lives. It's good to enjoy your lives, but if we have a large proportion, a growing proportion of our society who have given up hope of the very thing that is kind of has become what's enabled us as Canadians to help one generation build on the one before and the one next, this is a huge problem. So back on ownership, it has been very much bred into, you know, how we think of the Canadian psyche and what we've demonstrated. And I think the challenge we've created in this country, as demonstrated with stats, there's not a pathway to ownership. So I think, you know, and this is very much what we do at Habitat, is create opportunities. How do you build some pathways to ownership? While you're at it, how do you do that in a way so that you're also trying to keep assets affordable for others and keep assets we build available to others? Lots more to say, but that's more than my 2 minutes, so I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Thanks, Ian. One of the things that Michael mentioned is about the housing choice between kind of ground associated units and housing that's closer into the center of the city. And one of the things, of course, we've seen is that there's been a greater price escalation of ground associated units than there are of high-rise, either condos or even apartment rents. And with that short supply and rising prices, it means that people can't afford it. So they go for their second option and second choice, which means they decrease the demand for that. And they have an increased demand for condos and rental accommodation. Those prices go up. That's where the pressure comes in. The idea is we have to provide a broad range of housing choice across the board. And you can't just focus on one or the other. Right now, we have particular problems. The rents increasing dramatically. We've seen that happening. And then the question is, what about the rental supply? Well, the rental supply is now at risk because of increasing interest rates. It means that potential investors in either building purpose-built rental, which have been declining, or investors who are going to buy condos and rent them, have trouble making the financial numbers work to actually invest in those units. So we might see a decrease in the rental stock as well, unless the rents increase rapidly enough, which we don't want because they're less affordable. So we're in a real conundrum right now, and we have to find ways to expand the supply across the board. That includes, you know, the ground associated units in 905. It includes the high density downtown. It includes the missing middle as well. Of course, it's suffering because of the exclusionary zoning policies. The city is looking at that to some degree with their program of trying to expanding housing options in neighborhoods. But again, that might take too long to come on the market. We have to move more quickly to make those houses available. And then there's also the question of the take-up rate of people building that missing middle. In the US, it appears that was been put in places like Minnesota. I've talked to my colleagues who actually work in those areas. And although the exclusionary zoning has been removed somewhat, there hasn't been a rapid or quick take-up rate. So we can't expect a quick take-up rate. So we got to move along in all fronts to make a supply increase across the board.
So let me get to maybe some of the thoughts on how we can achieve this. And so one of the things that I got to do in 2019, I was in the Premier's office, so I got to help with the Housing Supply Action Plan and Bill 108. And I learned a few things in terms of the things that we did really well then, and some of the things where you know, there was the movement, but we need to go further. So I'm going to speak to two in particular: the provincial policy statement and the growth plan. And one of the things that was really good about the changes then is that added some quiet language about the municipalities needing to create a market assessment about where there are shortages, where we need more homes. And that was a big improvement. What that did is it signaled to them that they've got to not just say, we need more housing. We get that, thanks, we got that, we know that, but in particular, what kinds of housing? And do we have a real shortage of single detached housing? Do we have a real shortage of rental housing? And that was a great improvement. But what we need now is much more structure and importantly, discipline and enforcement around these kinds of assessments. So the province in the next little while should really be thinking about how to better articulate what exactly it would take to come up with on a city by city level, these kinds of assessments are shortages of single family detached or shortages of rental, and then arm themselves with the power that if the assessment and the mechanics of how they're going to reach that assessment in each individual segment of the market, if that's not sufficient, that the province has the power and has the clear reasoning that it's laid out in its assessment tools to say, we're gonna change these plans to make sure that they match an actual market assessment.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate that, all three. Our next question, I imagine anyone could go on for days on this one, but the notion, associated with, what it costs to build housing and the taxes, fees, and levies. So essentially, with taxes, fees, and levies undergoing exponential growth in the last decade, and within the framework of further substantial increases pending in certain municipalities, what impact are these charges having upon the range of housing options available to consumers? What reversals or amendments to these charges should you be considered to mitigate the negative impacts of these particular costs associated with housing? And perhaps, David, we could begin with you, followed by Ben, and then Ian.
Well, I think they've had impacts across the board because they are applied to all types of housing in all locations. And of course, we've seen dramatic increases from development charges to parkland dedication. And now we have community benefit contributions. And of course, the other issue I wanted to comment on here is inclusionary zoning, because inclusionary zoning is coming to the forefront. And inclusionary zoning, at least the way it's been applied in the first case, the City of Toronto, it acts just like an exaction. It's a mandatory charge to provide affordable housing. Many other jurisdictions do it in a different fashion. They do it in an incentive base to give increased density as trade-offs. And then, in fact, you split the increased value between providing affordable units and the owner of the property or the developer. That is not going to have as serious of an impact. In fact, it's going to create units. And in fact, the City of Toronto did have that in place in the waterfront area, where the secondary plan said all of the Section 37 was to be taken in terms of affordable housing. In that case, they created rental units, they created in-kind ownership units, and they got cash. So they got a lot of money in play rather than acting as another exaction and as a negative impact on the cost of development. And perhaps not having development in TOD areas where I said it's going to be put in place. So I'm just focusing on inclusionary zoning as being an issue that adds one more impediment if it's applied in that fashion. Now, other municipalities across Ontario, there's 12 or 14 looking at it, they haven't come into play yet. They have options of doing it differently. I know London was going to do it as a density bonus. Mississauga has a policy in place coming in January. So I haven't looked at that one in detail, but we have to see which approach for policy we're taking, the mandatory or the kind of density bonus offset kind of approach. And just to that end, I think the province now is talking about reducing or prohibiting development charges on inclusionary zoning, but I think that means they're going to treat that as an offset to the mandatory program in the City of Toronto. I think that's what the intent is, which is typical of many US inclusionary zoning policies. They do reduce or take away development charges on the inclusionary units.
So I'll start with that because it's an example of the overall problem. So think of all the capital expenditures that a city needs to do as a great big balloon, where there's this huge balloon of costs that they need to have on water, on sewers, on parks, et cetera, et cetera. If you try to push some of the capital costs that like the inclusionary zoning project would otherwise contribute to, they're pushing that down. But those capital costs aren't going away. So if you're trying to reduce the costs on one set of housing, this inclusionary zoning by reducing development charges, that balloon is still the same size. That it's just pushing the air out somewhere else. Section 37 is a similar problem, where Section 37 development charges, the reforms that started in 2019 happen together, where a city has a choice. You can introduce a capital charge through Section 37 with community benefits contributions, or convenient development charges. You got to pick a lane. So what's happened is that as Section 37 became a smaller charge, at least it was predictable. So there's some good things that happened there. As it became less and less of a revenue tool, cities are just going to increasingly rely on development charges. Again, think of it like a balloon. as cities are going to get less and less revenue from Section 37, more and more is going to have to go to development charges. So I think there's two solutions here. One is reduce the size of the balloons, reduce the size of the amount of capital that cities are trying to put onto new home buyers, because they're going to pay for it, whether it's through Section 37, inclusionary zoning charges, or development charges. There are lots of ways that, in particular with water, that we should be thinking about other ways of financing this kind of infrastructure through long-term user fees, and not all up front on home buyers. But the other solution, I think, is there's Section 37 has the way it's been redesigned has a lot more potential than the province initially limited it to. They limited it to only 4% of land value, but if we can think a little bit bigger, that land value is a much better base in which we should be collecting revenues from, much better than trying to have like a per unit tax, like a development charge. If we can increase the maximum land value that we're trying to exact from community benefits charges from 4 to maybe 6, 7, 8%, or even higher in high value areas, I think we can find a way to really reduce some of these other charges on home buyers.
So I think I'd come at this as well so let's start with the fact that, the nature of the housing crisis right now, it is bleeding into every other societal priority we have. It is bleeding into the cost of our healthcare system. It is bleeding into certainly our environment. It is certainly bleeding into our economic productivity, which affects our tax base. So if you start there, then you have to say, whenever we're looking at revenue instruments and fees, we have to say, are they going to move us ahead or backward in addressing this housing issue, which, as we've said, is both a supply and a suitability issue. So I think we're talking about development charges and fees, and I think this discussion of between the cities and the province, we need to get better at saying how much of the cost of what our cities need and our municipalities need should be carried by new housing, and how much should be cost by other revenue tools, the most obvious of which is property taxes. And we need to recognize when we keep burdening new housing, it is just instantly raising not only the cost of new housing, but as we all know in this webinar, that's what also raises the cost of resale housing, all of which adds up to being an equity issue because it just discriminates against the people who don't already own or rent a home. And so we'll exacerbate the problem we have. So Ben is right. We all have to recognize that things are not going to get better. They're going to get worse for governments in terms of their revenue situation. But getting smarter about how we are balancing and where we're getting those revenues from, so that the decisions that are being made actually work in favor of the housing affordability issue as opposed to against it, I think takes a lot of bravery and courage, but it's a critical part of this equation. I think and layered into this is, as we all know, we've had over 2 decades, prior to the last few years, we had over 2 decades of very little government money coming into social housing. And now that's part of what we're seeing. We are so far behind. The economic burden of that is huge and we can't catch up fast enough. But it still means getting much more intentional about what the concessions are and for whom and where. So we've talked about the inclusionary zoning part. We would argue that there should be harmonization of any concessions for rental, should be true for any kind of tenure where you're setting it up so you're keeping these units affordable from one owner to the next. So there's a lot in here about just how do we get much more surgical around what are where are we right now in 2022? What are the societal priorities that we need to focus on, and how do we make our fees move us towards them as opposed to away from them?
Thank you. Maybe just a little quick segue on the inclusionary zoning. We were talking at the beginning before we actually went on. Is there, what way would inclusionary zoning work better than what, for example, the models we have here? I think, David, you were mentioning about some other cities had done some stuff, and obviously it seemed much more sensible, their approach.
Well, I think you need to have some kind of density bonus. Works in many places. People misconstrue when things are mandatory. New York City is cited by the city of Toronto as being mandatory, and they just put inclusionary zoning on 42 blocks in Manhattan, but at the same time they upzone the 42 blocks. Atlanta is called mandatory around their beltway, but they give density bonuses for inclusionary zoning around the beltway and reductions of development charges. So if we get this called mandatory, doesn't mean it means you have to do it, but there's offsets put in place and a cost and value sharing in place. So there needs to be some kind of offsets and some kind of trade-offs involved, which is the key issue. Which I said, the waterfront area, when they used section 37, it was typical of format like many inclusionary zoning programs in the US. And it's what they're looking at in other countries like now, like South Africa, for example. So.
You have any thoughts on that?
So are we looking at Michael or
a better way to, implement inclusionary zoning if we're going down that route that actually, not going to discourage the building of housing?
So I'll go quickly on that, which is I think we've got to, fairly, we have to have more prescription in terms of what it really looks like. 99-year terms, for example, are a pretty costly way to impose this. And we have to remember at the same time that, things cost money, and you can pay for it with cost on home buyers, or you can pay for it through taxpayers. If you pick one. What we've decided with inclusionary zoning is that new home buyers are going to pay for social housing. But this is a social problem. This is a problem we should pay for with progressive income taxes or other general government revenues. That's a much more efficient way of dealing with this issue.
I just want to make one other quick point about the alternative that I pointed out. The City of Toronto program doesn't apply to rental housing because they don't want to discourage purpose-built rental. Those examples I gave you elsewhere, you can apply it to rental and get rental built on stack, purpose-built rental, which is something we're looking for to enhance.
The the position we took on this during the Toronto deputations was one, first of all, repeating what you've heard from my colleagues, you have to provide concessions or offsets. And the second was and I actually wrote a blog on this, the frustrating reality of moving slow to go fast with inclusionary zoning. So we urged real caution of the pace of putting this in, because having rolling out inclusionary zoning and having every single developer, say we actually can't make the numbers work, so we're not building anything, is not helpful to anyone. And so that's the other piece of just recognizing this is a move slowly. And unfortunately, inclusionary zoning discussions have ended up taking so much, airspace that they have, I think, created expectations that they will be a much bigger source of solving this problem than they really can be.
Thank you for that. We'll move on to question 3. And so in terms of increased housing options and consequently supply and affordability are significantly implemented by land use policies, as is the potential use of public land for housing development, as well as growth plans that incentivize density around mass transit infrastructure. Could you comment on maximizing densities around transit-oriented communities and the potential reconsideration of development prohibitions in or near green belts, or discuss other measures that could serve to increase housing options within municipalities based upon land use permissions? I know green belts aren't controversial, but why don't we start with Ben on that?
Sure. As to whether the question is, should we grow up or out? My answer is yes, which is we need to do both. So very quickly on the green belt. The green belt's not the issue, at least it's society-wide. The green belt's an issue for individual developers who have land that might be encumbered by the green belt. But the core of the problem is much more in the growth plan, and growth plan limitations that limit density, that limit, have intensification targets that don't really make a lot of sense. What we need to have is we need to have a real conversation about the future of the growth plan. The green belt is not the issue. It is the growth plan in terms of moving out. This goes back to having a system that responds to market demand. The growth plan does not respond to market demand. People want more detached homes, and the growth plan is not allowing that. We need to revise that. But on transit-oriented development, I'm going to give everyone some homework, which is that if you go to Bill 108, there's a preamble to it, and the preamble lays out the intentions of the bill. And it has at the very start of it, a statement that says the intention of Bill 108 is to fundamentally reform how we build housing around transit stations. What does that mean? So what we've gotten so far is we've had what I call TOC 1.0, which is the government is making a good start on building much more density on the transit station site, which is great, but it's a very small start. Bill 108 gave the government more powers to introduce what's called a community planning permit system. with the concept being that they should be introducing this around transit stations. So it's not just the transit site that the province is trying to increase density on, the whole area, up to say 800 meters, or even more around that area. And what it can do is it can, rather than have every individual development project get bogged down by a years-long review, the same thing's going to happen to the next place next door, and to the next place next door. We're going to do that review. We should do that review because we need to have community buy-in in terms of what that area around the transit station is going to look like. But rather than do it on a development by development basis, a community planning permit system brings that all up front and integrates variance, bylaw variance, zoning, and site plan approval all into one 45-day yes or no approval. And once you've done that kind of work for a neighborhood, once you know what you want the buildings to look like, once you know what the zoning is supposed to look like, a developer is going to have a quick answer, yes, no, within 45 days. Something like that's what we need around transit stations, because we need to have a balance between efficiency, but also a way for the community to get input. Because we're just going to try to railroad them by putting 30-story condos up wherever we want. If they can't take out their frustrations about that through the zoning process, they're going to take it out with barricading themselves to the concrete mixers or the bulldozers. People will find a way to protest if you don't give them a chance to have input.
Yeah, so I want to go in two directions here. The first is land in general, government land in general, and certainly government land and investments along transit corridors. Every stripe of government has made mistakes in the past on this, lost opportunities where we've started an investment or used government land and have not wired into it a requirement of affordable housing, schools, community amenities, etc. That has to stop. We just have to get much more intentional when we make these investments around what the future of these communities need to look like. So when developers are bidding on these projects, they are bidding in the context of how much market housing do they have to pay for and what else are they on the hook for doing. So that's the first thing. The second is I am going to acknowledge that I am absolutely no expert on the Greenbelt, but I do want to make a couple just comments or questions. I think it's time that we acknowledge that the Greenbelt was declared and designed in 2006. We didn't have full knowledge in 2006. In 2006, the average home price in the GTA was $330,000. It's different now. In 2006, agriculture was different than it is today. And so in 2006, we had some transit corridors that weren't there that are there now or are planned now. And so I think we also need to recognize respectfully that the population that is most activated around not touching the Greenbelt are people who happen to live quite near it. And so I think it is time that we actually at least have a thoughtful conversation around there. Ben's right, it's not a panacea either, but I think it's appropriate for us to say 16 years have passed. And let's look at least parts of the Greenbelt that are along some of the new transit corridors to say, is it time to change the lines in some places? And of course, when we do that, it has to be with significant expectations of the kind of communities and the kind of community amenities that should happen there. It would be an absolute failure if we took everything I just said and turned it into a whole lot more sprawl. That's not responsible thinking. But I think it is responsible to at least say, it was 16 years ago. Let's ask the question again.
Yeah. So just a quick response to it, which is on the facts of it, I agree with all of that. To me, the Greenbelt is just a neurological shortcut that people have in terms of connection to the environment and green space, and it makes sense. So to me, the debate with Ian's point is whether bringing that into the conversation, even though it's factually correct, like we should be thinking about transit stations along the Greenbelt, does triggering that neurological shortcut create more political headaches and downsides compared to the amount of gain that we're going to get for that specific land?
David?
I want to pick up on Ben's comments on the growth plan, because after the growth plan is put in place, the changes to it, municipalities are going through a comprehensive review in terms of how they're going to meet the needs of land for the future. And some municipalities had a balance where they're putting probably too much emphasis on infill rather than greenfield development. And if you permit that to stand, and there's more shortage of greenfield space for ground associated units, it's going to increase, those prices will go up, will put increased demand on the infill. So all the prices will be going up. And the question is, there seems to be a shortage of supply of land that's zoned in the official plans. I think Mike Moffett was talking about that only half the land was designated OPs across the GTA that are needed to meet the longer term supply. Where's it going to come from? So I think the municipalities have to look at this in terms of buying more short-term land supply and adhering to one of the provincial policy statements. Ben mentioned the provincial policy statement before. There's one area called section 1.3.1 that requires municipalities to keep a minimum of a 3-year supply of short-term land, means serviced and approved, available by housing type. Very few municipalities, maybe 1 or 2, are meeting that requirement of the PPS, and they're not reporting it as they're supposed to be to the province. So if we began to enforce that, you'd see where the shortage is. The whole idea here is you have to monitor land supply to know where you are. You can't just leave it to whim. You got to monitor and look at it. And that's been the success of other kind of containment policies. Like in Portland, which is kind of one of the hallmarks, one of the things they did, they always monitored land supply. And when prices went up because of short supply, they found ways to increase the supply to minimize the price increases. We have to do the same thing.
Okay, thank you. And our last question, planning and approval processes are inflexible, intolerably slow, and they discourage the maximized use of land for wider housing options. What can be done by the public sector generally and municipalities specifically to create a more responsive process that encourages innovation, increases accountability, and promotes first and foremost the building of housing in all forms? Maybe we can start with Ian, followed by David, and then Ben.
I'm going to try to be brief and beg an extra minute at the end to kind of circle back to a broader point. I think what Ted from CMHC put on the screen, I think in his very first slide, he had that quote about, planners don't really have a good sense of how the market works, and people that know how the market works don't have, aren't making the rules on planning. And so, but the one thing we should be able to agree on and get conviction on at government level is but what if we said that housing is one of our top 3 priorities at every level of government? And therefore, what if the ethos, at least for the next 3 years, became, we're going to take a housing lens to everything. So when we're thinking we need to, the municipal level has already done 3 transportation level studies, but now the region, just the upper tier region decides they need 2 more. We'll now take a housing lens to say, okay, is it going to make that much of a difference to augment the information we have now versus the time we'll spend on a delay? So I'm just going to be a bit simplistic here as I end this part of it. I just think part of the way we speed up approvals, et cetera, is it begins with all 3 levels of government saying housing is a priority. We need to make decisions from a housing lens, and therefore empower our bureaucracies to have somewhat more latitude on decisions that are driven by let's get the housing built, as opposed to let's check every single box.
Maybe we'll go with David and then Ben.
I think most people here have probably seen the recent benchmarking study by Altus that showed that approval times have increased by 27 to 51% from the beginning of COVID to now. Many people thought, oh, great, when COVID, people are starting to take in applications digitally, maybe this will be a start of some innovations. Well, apparently it hasn't been, because it's not just taking in the applications digitally, it's having the appropriate platform they move along and having timelines in place where people have to respond. It's also having the labor force, the planners in place with the technology and the skill set and be trained to move things along. So all of that comes into play of improving the system along those lines. We had Chris coming in with the concept of keys from the city of Toronto, and that got slowed down quite a bit. I think they didn't have the authority to oversee the planners and push things along. So you need some authority to be able to push things along, move them along. We made some recommendations for timeframes being faster in the Affordable Housing Task Force. I think we need the technology, we need the trained people, and we need the authority to enforce the timeframes as well. One other example is, of course, this showed that site plans are taking 15 to 20 site plan approval, 15 to 20 months. they're supposed to take 2 or 3 months at most. And these are way out of whack. So anyhow, we've got to find ways to improve this. And again, some of the way that's suggested might be movements along the right way. I think our last panelist today is going to tell us about some technological opportunities for this, which I think we have to pay careful attention to.
And so rather than give you a specific answer, I'm going to assign more homework to everyone, which is David and Ian were both members of the Housing Affordability Task Force. Their report's amazing. Someone wrote on Twitter that it's the most important document that's ever come out of the Ontario government. And if the things in the half of the stuff in that report get implemented, that will be an accurate statement. But right now it's just a report, and the government's picked up on 1 or 2 of the things in there. And even then, I think they watered them down. Everyone should go back to this report and hold the government to account in terms of the implementation of this. And there's just a couple in there even would go a long way. So everyone has to go back to that report, provinces, cities, see what they can implement. And some are going to be short term, so that they can do tomorrow in changing their bylaws. Some will take decades in terms of the scope of them. But that's what we should all be looking at and holding everyone to account on. Are they matching the progress of this task force report that they put out?
Thank you very much. And the last quick part, we have a few minutes left. Actually, I think I was looking forward to this the most, is the 1 minute elevator pitch. So you're trapped in the elevator with all the best and biggest policymakers and decision makers. What's your pitch? 1 minute each, just to how to fix this housing situation and in terms of supply and choice and everything else. You got 1 minute with these guys before you hit the ground floor. So what would you say? Let's start with Ian and go to David and Ben.
Well, I know Ben and David are coming after me, so I'm just going to be the opening act in the elevator. And I want to pick up where Ben left off. Ben's right. If if we can get half, if we can get a third of what's in that task force report implemented, it gets at a lot of stuff. And that brings us back to when the last session, both Mike and Eric were taking us in the direction of, we need to get our leaders and our society to make a shift in how we think about and talk about this issue. We need to get better at thinking about and reimagining about what housing in our community should look like in the future, and that different look is not a bad thing, is good for all of us. And people in my generation, we all got used to wearing seatbelts. We got used to the fact that you don't get to smoke in the airplane and all kinds of other things. Society adjusts. And we somehow need to get society to adjust to an image of what home and community looks like, that is denser, that's more compact, that has fewer cars, etc. And if we can get, and that will benefit folks like me who are of a generation that enjoyed a different kind of housing, that then helps us empower the kind of changes that are in that report and many others that have been talked about in the last 4 hours.
Ben and then David, and then the elevator stops.
Premier, in 10 years from now, you will be known for maybe 2 things. Long after you've retired, long after you've hung up your boots. One of those things is going to be that you were the premier during COVID. That is locked. The other thing is going to be something that you can define or will be defined for you. If you wish to define that you were the premier who built 1.5 million homes, you need to take some action. You need to make hard decisions. You made when it came to being known to the premier who got us through COVID, you made hard decisions. It's going to be like that for housing now. And are you willing to do that? Because if you're willing to do that, that's what you'll be known for. You can choose that, or you can be chosen. You can choose by default to be defined by something else, having done something else, and other people or other events will define that.
Thank you. And David, I'll wrap up with you.
Again, I echo the same thing very quickly. It's too many pieces to it, other than to say the big point is you have to increase housing supply of all types across the board. You have to have accessory units, laneway housing, missing middle, greenfield developments of all types of densities and built form right across the board. And again, try to look to some of the things in the Affordable Housing Task Force, how to get about that, improving the approvals process, getting people on board. But it's going to show leadership, and it's going to have to show some vision. It's going to have to demonstrate to people what the benefits could be from the outcome in the future.
Thanks. And thank you to all three of you. Actually, when it comes to housing, I'd love to be stuck with any of you in an elevator and have a nice long chat, because you're all three are amazing. Thank you very much.
Anytime, Michael.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. So now we're the last session is coming up. So if you can, everyone can please join us for the final session. It's digitizing the development approvals process with Arash Shahi, and then closing remarks with Richard Lyle, our president of RESCON. Arash will be discussing how ACO's Innovation Labs prototype and pilot project in Simcoe County will act as a proof of concept for the One Ontario initiative, and will set the stage for a more efficient development approvals process across Ontario and help tackle the housing supply crisis by streamlining the approval system and reducing costs. Once again, thank you very much for the panel. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you at the next session.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.